Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, straight from front lawn of the Diggi Palace. The festival is protected by Dettol. It is our pleasure to present Words, Image, Text, Ranjit Hoskote in conversation with Anupama Raju. Straddling the worlds of the literary imagination and the visual arts, celebrated author, poet, translator and curator Ranjit Hoskote introduces us to the multiverse of word, image and text he inhabits. Hoskote's collections of poetry include Vanishing Acts, Central Time, the Atlas of Lost Beliefs and the forthcoming PunchPros. He curated India's first ever national pavilion at the Venice Biennale. Under the title, Everyone Agrees It's About to Explode. In conversation with Anupama Raju, he gives us a glimpse into his aesthetic vision and his understanding of the contemporary literary and cultural landscape. Ranjit Hoskote is a poet, cultural theorist and curator. His 7 collections of poetry include Vanishing Acts, Central Time, the Atlas of Lost Beliefs. His translation of a celebrated 14th century Kashmiri woman saint's poetry has appeared as Lalla, the Poems of Lal Ded. Anupama Raju is a poet, literary journalist and translator. She is the author of 9, a book of poems, and her work has been widely anthologized and published. Ladies and gentlemen, we request you all to please comment and ask questions. We now present Word, Image, Text, Ranjit Hoskote in conversation with Anupama Raju. Over to you, Anupama.
Good afternoon, Ranjit. Hello, how are you?
Good afternoon, Anupama. It's great to be here in a digital simulation of the front lawn at Diggi Palace. And looking forward very much to our conversation.
Totally. And thank you so much to the entire Jaipur Literature Festival team for coming up with such a novel virtual lawn. It's great to be talking to you today. So, Ranjit, this session is called, it's really, I think, completely aptly titled. It kind of perfectly, captures, I think, the essence of your work. So, you are an artist of the visual and the verbal arts, right? So do word, image and text collide, or do they coexist in your artistic universe?
Anupama, it's amazing you should say this because, I have had and continue to have these trajectories in the visual arts, in the literary arts, and as a listener in music. Where I don't play any instrument and unfortunately don't sing except in the shower. But unlike you, you're an accomplished singer. But when I think back about where the whole experience of the arts began for me, it was really at home, in a family with parents who were deeply committed to the arts. So, and the first of these was music, actually. It just struck me when I was speaking to a friend, Sarabjit Garcha, the other day, and he asked me this, what came first, the word or the image? And I've said neither. It's probably music. So my earliest memories are the LPs that my parents used to play on their Gara turntable. And their taste is eclectic. So it could be Ali Akbar Khan Sahab on the Sarod and Ravi Shankar on the sitar one day. It could be Mozart another day. It could be what else was prominent in the 60s when they collected so many of the records. It was an introduction to color, to tempo, to cadence, and all of that coming in through this amazing musicality. And in my mind, these things used to translate very easily. Color to sound to haptic feeling. So as I grew up, I assumed everybody responded in quite the same way. And it's only a little later that I realized that I was synesthetic. So there's a neurological basis for my response to the various arts, because I do experience them in that way. So I don't have a simple answer for what came first. And they certainly don't collide. I think what I find most interesting for me as an artisan to work with is the way they translate. So when I'm working on a poem, it's actually how the senses and their offerings translate from one into the other. So word and image again, they're not it's not a binary for me.
Well, thank God for that, because I think as readers, we are all lucky for that. Now, talking of that, I mean, these influences that you mentioned, I think the books that I've read and enjoyed so much over the years, right? Especially this music that you refer to, I think it has come in quite consciously or perhaps even unconsciously. Do you agree?
Unconsciously in the sense that cadence, musicality has always been profoundly important to me. I mean, I know that people have been very kind in responding to my work, and they often stress its visuality, and it certainly has a strong visuality. But what is equally, if not more important to me, is the music of the language, the music of the language as it opens up and embraces other languages. So in the Jonahwhale poems, for instance, the presence of the bandish from Tomris, from Kashmiris, from Chaitis is extremely strong. As quoted, but also as it informs what goes on in my particular form of English. So that's definitely a powerful presence for me, and it's become more conscious now, because I realized that for the longest time I was trying to keep these interests and preoccupations separate, and in the last 5 or 6 years, that's just dissolved for me. It's just, I'm the same person. I'm the person who loves Steve Reich's music. I'm the person who loves Terry Riley's music. I'm also the person who listens to Begum Akhtar. I'm also the person who reads W.S. Graham and Charles Sinnich. So why do I have to hold these things in separate domains? So the collapse of the walls that separated these things has really been very liberating for me personally as a poet, and I hope to convey that to my readers and listeners.
That's great. Talking of powerful presence, I think time and travel and culture have all been very, very important preoccupations in your books, right? Right from Vanishing Acts to Jonahwhale, and of course the Atlas of Lost Beliefs. What do you think, and how did that evolve over the years?
Actually, I think it goes back longer than that, because Vanishing Acts, as you'll remember, is a new and selected poems. So it also includes the first 3 books: Zones of Assault, The Cartographer's Apprentice, and The Sleepwalker's Archive. So notions of the atlas, the archive, mapping have always been important to me. The experience of travel has actually been crucial for me, partly because it's inherited, because as I've said often enough, I belong to a diasporic micro-minority. So in some sense, we are shaped by our travels and by our encounters with different cultural zones. So if I have to think about my cultural identity, it is already diasporic, it is already multilingual, it already straddles what look like barriers between religions and regions. So this to me is and has always been a source of great optimism, and I've drawn on it in many ways. And in my own life too, I've really been wonderfully stimulated by the kind of curiosity that comes into play when you're elsewhere, the kinds of dialogues, the unselving, what you learn when you slip from one language into another. And it's really all of these experiences of self-fashioning that I think inform my poetry. And culture and history have always been at the core of my interest in the world. But it's not necessarily, in my poetry, it's not necessarily about bearing witness to a historical period. For instance, it could be that when I look at a certain kind of Spanish painting, royal portraits, what actually seizes my attention is the child playing with a spaniel, and how that innocence is actually guaranteed, undergirded, but also threatened by the omnipresence of war. It's things like that that leap out from the historical tapestry for me.
Fantastic. I mean, that kind of makes me want to ask you those questions. Do you experience more freedom as a curator of art? Does that give you wings much more than when you write?
No, I have a sense that in each of my practices, I respond to things that are particular to those practices, and they each open up into a kind of realm of freedom. So when I'm curating, again, curating is a very diverse animal. I mean, you might be doing a monographic exhibition which is devoted to one artist, or you might be doing an exhibition that bears witness to a movement or a school or a tendency. Or, as I've often been doing now, you might be working on a transhistorical exhibition. So one of the finest such experiences for me, again, in terms of what it did for me, was an exhibition I did some years ago called The Sacred Every Day, which was across two venues, the Adil Shah Palace in Panjim and the Convent of Santa Monica in Old Goa. And it looked at how the sacred is part of our everyday. And it's part of our everyday in syncretic, confluential ways. And the people who've made these images have not worked from some simple primer of what is proper to a religion. So you might have a burak, which actually draws on the Kamadhenu, or a Kamadhenu that draws on the burak, images of Sufi masters that draw on Vaishnav imagery. So in that exhibition, some of the earliest works came from the 6th century. And the most recent had been literally done a couple of months before the show. So that's a certain kind of imaginative freedom.
Right.
But it's also the kind of freedom I have when, for instance, I work on a project like Confluences, which is a book that Ilya Troyanov and I wrote together on precisely how civilizations work through and because of differences. Not by upholding their differences. It's by coming together in unpredictable ways. So that, to me, and in my poetry too, that's exactly increasingly what works for me, what brings me this tremendous sense of freedom.
Right. Right. So when you talked about the exhibitions, I was just thinking, quite often your poetry or reading a book is almost like experiencing an exhibition, because there are so many. It's a visual. It's a very multi-sensory experience, because there are so many cross-references, so many of these influences that come in. So which leads me to my next question. How are your poetic protagonists created? I find that very fascinating. They're all so intricate and so detailed. Please tell us.
I've traveled with these figures for a very long time. So there are times when I would deliberately trace through research a particular figure. Sometimes things pop up in another part of your life, and then they become the subject of your poetic interest. But childhood heroes, for instance, are important to you because they speak to some aspect of your personality. So for me, Jonah, the recalcitrant prophet, very unlikely prophet, or Captain Nemo, who we later learn through the Verne canon was actually an Indian prince, or Odysseus, of course. These are Ahab from Moby Dick. I mean, these are people to whom I had an incredible attraction as a child, as a teenager. Moving on in life, you also realize that they each emerge from a particular historical context. So what tends to happen, particularly in Jonahwhale, is a sort of shuttling, a to and fro between these characters as these solitary driven heroes and the system, the machine, the world history from which they emerge, which also has to do with colonialism, with discovery, with genocide. So for me, it's always about keeping these two things in play. It's not a cult of the solitary hero at all.
Okay. So please read for us now. I think I'd love to hear these, characters speak to us. Would you like to read from Jonahwhale or Central Time?
Sure. Maybe I could read. And since we are speaking of as and of poets, maybe I should think about a poem like Ghalib in the Winter of the Great Revolt,
Amazing.
which is from Vanishing Acts.
Great.
Ghalib in the Winter of the Great Revolt, Delhi, 1857. The emperor's murdered grandsons hang from the gate of peace like hushed bells, and rifles drill the sentenced air. My neighbor, the flautist, slit his veins last night, burning his prayer book before he died, true to a god of subtle tones, wasted on the deaf. Ghalib writes to a friend, all around us the furies ride their burning horses. It's as though Taimur had broken Delhi's walls again, his cinder-streaked soldiers heaping pyramids of skulls in the streets, and a bakus for orphans to compute, the profits of betrayal, the penalties of defeat. Cannon, the only thunder, writes Ghalib, and no rain. Gunners waving St. George's flag have driven the nobles from their charred mansions, tethered the peasants to the surly river. The coppersmith, tapping at a dead branch, fills the vacant sky with the privacy of his grief. The friend, with a spy at his shoulder, writes back, when did you become a poet of adjectives, roosting in the rafters of a broken house? Ghalib, the owl must hide in the tamarind for now, but the genies of havoc will go on furlough soon. You say your inkwell is empty, but your dry quill still claws at the fibers of the heart. A pharmacist may drug himself with lyric, Ghalib replies, and a tiger may vanish in the rainforest of his hunter's dreams. But the dry quill is a reproach, and this raw winter could be the living tomb of my song. Send paper, friend. These are the last pages of my journal I'm writing on.
That is such a stunning end. Thank you so much. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to read more with the time that we have. I'm just moving on to something else now. You have mentored so many poets in your time. I myself have been lucky to have your mentoring and your friendship over the years. I know that Nissim Ezekiel played a seminal role in your work. So, did Nissim play a role in your mentoring as well? How did he influence you?
Anupama, you're very kind. For me, it's the responsibility and weight of the mentor role is something to which we can all aspire, maybe. But for me, it's a much more modest form of just helping open doors and sharing things with people. Basically, it comes out of that sort of ethic. Nissim was immeasurably more open, more generous with his time, energy, and he was an extraordinary figure, really. And he was mentored to 3 or 4 generations, depending on how you count, of poets. And his doors were always open at the office of the PEN Center in Theosophy Hall in South Bombay. So yes, I see him as my guru, as a mentor. But I also want to say that, before I go on to say that, it's a beautiful memory, actually, because my father took me to see him when I was very young. Mm. And I saw him through the door of the PN office, which is high old wooden door, and there was just this one lamp and its frosted glass lampshade, and there he was with his crown of white hair under this lamp. Sort of a forbidding figure, but the minute you walked in, you knew how welcoming and responsive he was. I think the great feature of Nissim's mentorship is that he never imposed his own poetics or his understanding of poetry on you. And in fact, very early on, it became clear that we had 2 completely divergent understandings of what poetry was about. And I regret to say, with the arrogance of youth, I was very radical in stating this difference. But but his generosity was just amazingly inclusive. And I think it helped produce a diverse culture of poetry rather than just one dogmatic way of doing it. But equally, as I wanted to say, whether it was Nissim or Dambares or Adil Jassawala or Keki Darawala or any member of that marvelous generation, it wasn't this kind of hand-holding that people imagine when they think about mentorship. I was a bit impatient one day last year, and I tweeted out to say that it wasn't all holding hands around the campfire and singing Kumbaya.
I remember that.
So these were tough taskmasters. They also expected you to go out and do your own work and find your own way, and they would be at hand. And sometimes sudden illuminations would be made available. And they didn't hesitate to tell you when things weren't working. And that's how it was.
Yeah, I think that's critical, and the honesty that comes with the generosity, I think, makes it even more precious.
Absolutely.
That's great. Going back to your role as a curator, what really challenges you, or what tires you, as much as whatever is inspiring about it?
I don't think anything in curating tires me. From the level of conceptualizing an exhibition to working on it, on the brass tacks of it, because for me it's like a handcrafting activity. That's how I came to curating, and that's how I practice curation. It's not about simply coming up with an idea and a list of artists or an object registry. It's about thinking the exhibition through and planning it, designing it, setting it up, hanging an exhibition, working on the didactics, the outreach, the events. So it's like a set of concentric circles. And curating also for me has expanded into other forms and other genres as well. So there's been a consistent trajectory for me now of literary curatorial work. For 5 years, I co-curated first with Kevan Mehta and then with Asad Lalji, the literature section of the Kalaguda Festival. Set in motion a feature which you remember, you've read there, The Long Evening of Poetry, which I originally called Under the Tree of Tongues and then called Hope Street Poets.
Yes.
So when you're working with...
It's a splendid experience.
at the David Sassoon Library. So what I find really engaging in curatorial practice is the particularity of the medium. What does it mean to convene a group of poets across a long evening? What is the cadence and the tempo of that? I mean, there you take on the role of a sort of conductor with a symphony orchestra. But how do you work with objects? That's a completely different set of interrelationships that you create. So curating for me is actually an endless source of wonderment. And I think wonderment, as you'll agree, I'm sure, Anupama, is at the heart of everything we do as poets or as musicians or as painters or curators.
Amazing, Ranjit. Your role as translator, there's so much of work that you have done. What is it that keeps you going? I mean, sometimes I wonder, how do you find the time to do all of what you do? I mean, it's amazing. So tell us about your translations.
The translations. Again, I seem to be at a point encouraged by the quiet isolation and repose of last year, where I'm thinking back to where things began. So when I think back to what it meant to be a young Anglophone poet in the late 80s and through the 90s, on the one hand, we were defending an embattled position, because there were so many people, the nativists and others, who kept saying, oh, you can't write in this language. It's the colonizers' language. You've heard all this. And on the other hand, certainly and I know a number of my friends and colleagues, Arundhati Subramaniam, Jerry Pinto, Muslim Sardalvi, Sampurna Chatterjee, to name but four. All of us have also been conscious of being multilingual readers, multilingual listeners, multilingual people. So over the years, I think happily for many of us, that embattlement has, if not dissolved entirely, it's certainly diminished in force. And translation for many of us was a key activity in this respect. I think we were also inspired by poets who'd gone before and who were active and present to us. Dilip Chitre, Agar Shahid Ali, Raman, A.K. Ramanujan himself, Arvind Mehrotra, and these were all Arun Kolatkar. Their example was unfolding before us at this time. And we in turn turn to translation because it opens up a different universe of literature, of how to handle language, what to do with the image, cultural contexts. There's an incredible, Cheto Vistara, as Tagore liked to say. There is an expansion of the consciousness that translation brings about. And it's not that static idea that too many people have of, taking something that is in a source language and somehow finding room for it in a target language. Quite apart from the irritating military metaphor involved there. It also commits you to some very static notion of these languages and what's inside them. That's simply not how it works. It's a far more complex and subtle activity.
No,
and,
I agree.
Yeah, and also, especially to us as poets who are also committed to translation, it expands your own language. So for me, that's the glory of translation. That's the beauty when it actually breaks up and remakes your own language and comes into your own poetry. And I found that happening increasingly now. And I really cherish that. So translation is not something that I do on the side. To me, it's an integral part of my work as a poet.
Absolutely. Now we know that something special is happening very soon. We have your forthcoming book, right? So very, very special book called PunchPros. Tell us about PunchPros.
PunchPros is, it's a book that actually came together in far less time than my books of poems usually come together. I usually work for 2 to 3 to 4 years on a book. This one really just seized me and my attention, and it really got written in about 18 months. But when I say that, it shouldn't lead to the idea that every single poem leaped out and was present, because my whole way of working is to work with fragments and notations that get built up over the years. But there was just this incredible sense of energy in revisiting a lot of things. New things came up. The world throws challenges at you. So for me, the circumstances of ecological catastrophe, of genocide, of forced migrations, all of these, which have been real to me for a long time, they made an incredible claim on me and on my language. I realized I had to remake my language, refashion and recraft it to respond adequately to these experiences. Also, an opening up to the natural world, a rediscovery, if you will, of what it means to write about nature. I mean, eco-poetics is now a compelling alternative for many people.
Right.
And it's becoming real to us. And I've had a certain journey with this experience and practice of eco-poetics. So in that sense, many of these poems respond to this, but they also respond to political crises. They respond to the question of what it means to be a citizen. Above all, to me, I think it's about breaking and mending. What happens to things that are broken? How do we mend them? How are they healed? And what survives? There are many poems which are about extinctions, endings, and resurrections in this book. And to me, the more I think about it, I think it's what we create and what we leave behind that makes this whole dark journey worthwhile. So I've also been thinking about afterlives. These are strange things to be thinking about.
But we are in strange times. So.
We are indeed, yeah. So that's, and the title also has to do with a claim that I think poetry makes. Because too often we allow ourselves to sit down quietly in a corner someone else has painted for us. We say, oh, poetry, elitist activity, minority interest, hardly anybody reads it, which, by the way, is not even true. It's just that they read it and they find it in different ways: page, stage, spoken word, epic, scripture, and so forth. So that's the kind of claim that the title puts forward. I mean, poetry may seem to be some deformed version of prose, but then I, think back to the idea that prose is simply poetry set to a different kind of tempo.
Yeah, a different kind of music, I say.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Would you like to read something from PunchPros?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, thank you. And for those of you tuned into the session, advance copies are available. So do order. And if you're in Bombay, Ranjit promises to sign the copies.
Wonderful. I love commercial breaks. Okay, here we are. This is a poem called Hawk. Caught up on the wave of the past, a hawk skirls back, ripping the seamed and sutured scar of our passage. Its wings are lined with scripts no one can read, but everyone brawls over in this city of howling dogs and whinnying saints. The blood that spurts under its claws is common, the sort you could smell anywhere, the sort you can smell everywhere. Suffer us all, dear God of many names, to come together and feed ourselves to that insatiable beak.
Scary, but but so real, I think.
Yeah, well, and this one's called Sovereign, which makes some play with what that might even mean. Because that's something else I've been thinking about over the years, that our commitment to the personal lyric in English particularly stems from an Enlightenment idea of the sovereign individual self. How do we break that lyric open to engage with the concerns of multitudes, of other species? So are we really sovereign? So sovereign is what this poem is called, and it goes like this. Plucking sunsets from the water, the horned sovereign half stamps, half slides across the beach, stopping to dig, claw, rake. What washes up is drilled shale, lost static past from gulf to strait. Plastic whirls in whose wake gagged dolphins trail, scarred humpback whales whose shadows will drift unmoored up thawing glaciers. What washes up is news of the cracked ice, across which a shivering fox is making her way from Svalbard to Nunavut, leaving her paw prints on frozen currents to a shore stippled with burst nebulae, a shore that on a compass dizzy with wind-scattered directions, she can and can't call home.
Splendid. It's always a pleasure to listen to you read.
Thank you, Anupama.
Ranjit, I think we have a few questions coming in.
Okay.
And what we'll do is maybe you'd like to address a couple of those, and then perhaps if we have time, you could read more. Would that be
Sure,
okay?
happy to do that. Absolutely.
Okay, great. So the first question is from Kashish. Being a multilingual, drawing from diverse sources, do you at times feel the incapability of not belonging?
Oh, okay. No, I think we belong best when we belong to multiple contexts. And I take heart from our own history as South Asians, which we forget because we seem to think that our history has always been as our history is now. We've been sitting in this little box called the nation for not very long. The box called the nation is not very old. It's a European idea emerging from the Romantic moment, and its history doesn't go back much longer than some point in maybe the Congress of Vienna, 1815. So, and then we have all these other little regional boxes that we like to sit in, of language, of region, and so on. But the truth in South Asia for thousands of years is that we have been a people who have migrated, who have been multilingual. As I'm never tired of saying, even this limiting idea of the mother tongue, it was absent in India. There is no word for mother tongue before the colonial encounter and the arrival of philology. You know, Matrabhasha, Madhuri Zaban, these are calques of Muttersprache from our friends, the German romanticists. So before that, we were people who spoke typically multiple languages, had multiple first language competence, read and wrote in different languages, often had different religious practices all going on at the same time. So that is the historic lived experience of plurality that I draw on for my pluralism. So as a multilingual, long-winded answer to this very precise question from Kashish, but I find that I'm enriched by my multilingual reading. So I particularly, for instance, during these months of the lockdown, sat down to simply revisit or visit for the first time Hindi poets whose work I've loved. So I reread Ashok Vajpayee, I reread Kanwar Narayan. At the instance of Nancy, my wife, who was working on Nagarjun's poetry. I had not been familiar with his work, but I read some of Nagarjun. And it's been absolutely marvelous because when you enter another language, you also enter its complexities. And you then encounter traces of Braj, of Avadhi, of Khadi Boli, of Sanskritization, of Persianization. You know, a language is a form of life, as Wittgenstein pointed out. So the more you have of them, the more vibrant you're likely to be. So I believe in this sense of a distributed belonging. It's what gives me energy and strength.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so Dhriti asks, I would love to know your take on modern day abstract poetry that we read these days.
My goodness, I have to plead complete and absolute ignorance. What on earth is abstract poetry? I certainly know what concrete poetry is, but abstract poetry, I'm not very sure. If by abstract poetry is meant a reliance on abstractions, I can only say that to me, poetry proceeds from the concrete particular. Having said that, I do respond to poetry that makes wider declamatory sweeps. But for me, I suppose a simple answer would be that I would not start out with a sense that any one kind of poetry or poetics is paramount. I'm as happy to respond to very, very different kinds of poets. And I think it's the diversity of what we receive as readers of poetry that, again, enlarges our sense of what's possible as poets.
Totally. We have another question. Is it hard to balance between being an art curator and a writer?
Oh, not at all, actually. Partly because I actually have been using this image now, but I love it, so I'm going to indulge myself. I see this for me as a starfish. My concerns and commitments and deep existential investments in the various arts. So it's not one at the expense of the other, one in contrast to the other. For me, I actually tend to learn more about, say, poetry when I'm curating, or when I'm writing on an artist, I happen upon a model of practice or a form of artisanal choice that then actually helps me when I'm translating, for instance. You know, so for instance, if I'm thinking about an artist whose primary approach is through assemblage or montage, one part of my mind is thinking, how do I do this with words? How do I do this with images? How do different voices come together? You know, some years ago, actually more than a decade ago, I sat down to work with Vanraj Bhatia, who was one of our unsung masters of contemporary music.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah, and so unsung. But Girish Karnad had asked him to turn Agni Varsha, Girish's play, into an opera. And Vanraj asked me to write the libretto. So it was a three-cornered collaboration. And I learned so much working on that libretto. I mean, for all kinds of reasons, particularly because I was just traveling so much, I had to give up after a certain amount of work on Act 1. But I learned so much by apprenticing myself to Girish and to Vanraj. And in Jonahwhale, for instance, the choric form is very prominent because I did then approach some poems as though they were libretti. So you have a play of different voices. And so one art or one artistic practice actually benefits another for me. I don't see them as cancelling each other out at all.
This collaboration is a really amazing process, isn't it?
And I know you're deeply committed to it.
Right. Yeah.
But I agree. I think it's carrying forward conversations by different means.
Totally. So I'm told we have a couple of minutes left. Would you like to read something, or would you like to take one question? What would you prefer?
I could take a question.
Okay. Do you think the beauty of long poetry or rhythmic poetry is slowly fading?
On the contrary, I think I think there is space both for the long poem, and there is always space and time and a love for rhythmic poetry. Remember that I can't think of too much poetry that does not have rhythm. It's one of the key definitions. It's only a question of tuning your ear to different kinds of musicality, as we've been saying. So I think, particularly in our fragmented times, I think we would look forward to certain forms of long poem. But they could be garlands, they could be archipelagos. They may not look immediately as if they were a long poem, but sometimes you might finish a book of poetry and realize that the whole thing actually hangs together as one long poem.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Ranjit, it's been such a delight to be in conversation with you, especially given our friendship. So it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you to the entire Jaipur Literature Festival team for putting this together. Hope that we can all meet in the real lawns of Diggy Palace sometime on the other side of the pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anupama.
Thank you, Ranjit and Anupama, for introducing us to a luminous world of verse and word. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo, and thank you all for watching and being such a lovely audience. If you enjoyed the session, please do pick up your copy of the book from the Amazon bookstore. Please do stay logged on to watch with us the series of exciting sessions that we have specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring to you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would be delighted and grateful for your support towards Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome. Please do tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 and tag us at Jaipur LitFest. The festival is protected by Dettol. We hope to see you in our next session.